Hello, I'm Patty Dellinger.
And my name is Evan Crawley.
We work with the Lincoln County Soil and Water Conservation District. Today we're outside listening to the birds chirping, the beautiful green plants and the grass that's growing around. We're going to take this time to talk about pollination. Now, a lot of times people think that only during the spring or the summer when the plants are blooming, when everything's green, that pollination occurs, but actually it's a year-long process. Pollination is very important. It's an important part of the life cycle of plants. So Evan, can you tell us what exactly is pollination?
Sure. So pollination is whenever you have pollen going from plant to plant to plant and able to cause reproduction in that plant to either produce flowers or produce a fruit or vegetable, something like that that comes off the plant. So and what you usually see is you have different type of bugs, or even you have hummingbirds or birds, but a lot of times it's our bee species that can cause those pollen, I guess the little pollen dust that comes off of the plant itself get attached to those species, and it goes from, like you can see all through, you have all these different places. They'll go from plant to plant to plant, taking that pollen and distributing it between those to, like I said, produce those different flowers or fruits that come off of those. So.
Okay, so I guess if you're saying bees, butterflies, those are called pollinators. Mm-hmm. So after the flower becomes pollinated or the pollen is deposited, what actually happens to that plant or the flower?
What it does is it pretty much just goes through a reproductive cycle. It causes that to either flower out or create the fruit itself. So like I said, the pollen goes in. Once it goes into that section of the plant, the female section, it starts to create what it needs to, whatever that flower has. So even for trees, our trees have to be pollinated as well. That's why right now everything is green outside. Our trees go through a huge section, and there's different plants that go through pollination, or at least mass pollination is at different times. So that's why we have so much green on all of our cars right now, is because trees are blowing all that pollen out of there, out of their leaves themselves. They're pushing it out, and they're trying to go from tree to tree to produce what you see on them right now. So and that's why we have pollen that you can see right now. But usually for our flowering species and different things like that, even our vegetables, fruits, they have to have a little bit different carriers to be able to take that pollen from plant to plant. So that's why you'd have to have your bug species, from everything from bees to butterflies to smaller bugs and flies that can take them, and so on. So that's
okay. For our younger students, one way that I like to use this example is just imagine you're eating a bag of Cheetos, something really orange with butter on it, and then you have all of that on your fingers, and you go and you pick up a piece of paper or you touch something else, you see that orange comes off your fingers and it goes on something. That gives you an idea just how pollination works. So it actually gets on the pollinator, and when they go, it's on their leg or somewhere on the insect itself, and when it goes to the other plant, as Evan said, it leaves it on there. When it gets on that, it will leave it on that plant as well. So bees are one of the main pollinators that we have. Today we're very fortunate to be able to work with Ralph Harlan. He is a member of the Lincoln County Beekeepers Association. So we're going to turn over and let Ralph talk to us about bees, the importance of bees in the hives, and what he does.
Thank you. Good morning. Working bees is a lot different than most people imagine. There is a lot of learning and thought that is put into keeping your bees. As a beehive grows, you must look into it and monitor it as you go. Bees have been kept by people for over 4,000 years now. The first beekeeping was not actually beekeeping. We were robbing bees from the wild, and that goes back, I think, about 13,000 years. So in the past 4,000 years, we've made a lot of progress keeping bees, particularly in the past 25 years. We now have the science and the ability to study bees and understand more and more what's happening. The bees are still wild animals. It's not like a normal farm where the cow or the sheep or the chickens are all domesticated and we pretty much work with them. Bees are still a wild animal, and we manage the colonies to their benefit, and we try to understand what would be to their benefit. Pollination is a big event for beekeepers, particularly those that do migratory beekeeping, and they will move thousands of beehives all over the country. The biggest pollination event is in early February in California with the almond trees, and there will be as many as 2 million bee colonies in California for the almond pollination, and they'll be brought in from Florida and all over the country. The problem with that is that we only have about 2.5 million colonies of bees in the country. So if anything is going wrong at the almond pollination, disease, pathogens of any kind, parasites, it all gets spread around there, and it could be a catastrophic event. So in working beehives, we have a lid to keep the weather out. We have a box that we keep them in, and most of our boxes have some form of movable frame, and each comb in the hive is on that frame, and that way a beekeeper or an inspector can come in and search for various disease problems. So when we work bees, we lift the lid off. Then there's an inner cover, and the inner cover is to prevent the bees from gluing the lid directly to the box. Bees go out and harvest Propolis, which is a variety of tree saps and gums from different plants, and they will glue everything together with that. It seals cracks and joints. They coat the inside of the hive with Propolis. Propolis is an antibiotic and an antiviral agent, and so it is part of their immune system. We have a Hive Tool. There are a variety of Hive Tools and shapes, but essentially a Hive Tool is used for prying and scraping. And we pry the different parts of the hive apart as we work it to break the seal that the bees have made with the Propolis. And we're trying to do it slowly and gently and not make a lot of noise. Particularly if the weather is cool, if you separate the boxes suddenly with the Hive Tool, it will make a loud crack sound, and that really excites bees. They don't like to hear that kind of noise.
As he's pulling that box apart, you notice that we all have on veils. And so for the elementary age students, if you see boxes like this in a field, do not go and try to open it. It is very wise to be equipped or have the proper gear on. So just make sure you don't go out and try to do this on your own.
A well-developed hive can have 60,000 bees in it.
60,000
bee stings can really hurt. This is Propolis, and the Propolis that has been developed here was from last year, and so now it is dried and hard. Propolis is a gum and a resin combination from the various trees and plants, and so when it comes in, it's very sticky. And if you get it on you or get it in your clothes, it's really hard to get it out. As you see, if you're gentle when you open the bees, they don't come boiling out of here trying to attack you or defend you themselves, but bees sting mostly as a defense. If I were loud, if I came in and bumped the box, then they would be a lot more defensive than they are. Moving slowly, particularly over the top of a hive, is a good idea, because when you move quickly, it attracts their attention and brings them out to find out what's going on. When you look down into a hive, the area between the frames, we call it a seam. And as you look down into the seams, you can see bees built up in part of the hive and less over in the other part. Typically where they're built up in a cluster, a heavy group like this, is where the brood is, the young bees. And over to the side is typically where they will put food, and there's a separation frame usually between the brood and the honey food that has stored pollen. The pollen is eaten by the brood, the larva, and it's that pollen mixed with exudes from the mandibular gland in the bee's head that will produce what we call bee bread, and that's what you feed the larva. In trying to open up a box to begin with, looking at the seams, you try to decide which seam would be least likely to disturb bees as you lift the frame out, because once you get that frame out, you have more space for the following frames. You gently pry the frame from both sides because they will build propolis between the two frames and glue them together. And that is a plastic foundation that came from one of the other beekeepers when they got out of beekeeping, and I have not had a real good experience having bees draw out plastic foundation. I know that the commercial pollinating beekeepers use a lot of plastic because it's easier to clean at the end of the year. If they have a box, hive that dies, they can go in and clean those boxes up those frames up very easily and put them back into use. I use pressed wax foundation, which is more, I guess, natural to the bees. This frame is completely drawn out with wax. This frame is probably 2 years old, but you can see the propolis built up on the side of the frame here where they glued this frame to the adjoining frame. If you look carefully down in, you can see the nectar that was brought in, and they are evaporating the moisture out of the nectar, and that becomes honey. Honey typically has a moisture content of less than 19%. As long as the moisture content is less than 19%, honey doesn't go bad. They've eaten the honey out of King Tut's tomb. That's 3,000 years old honey. That's pretty old honey.
So honey does not go bad?
Honey does not spoil. Now this frame has some brood on it. The brood is capped. There's a nice frame here with a bee that has pollen on the pollen baskets of her back legs. You can see the 2 yellow dots on either side of that one bee. And that bee will bring the pollen in, and she will find a cell, and she will offload the pollen and pack it into that cell. And then another house bee will come in and use the top of her head to bunt that pollen deeper and deeper and pack it into the cell. It's interesting that the head on a bee is triangular and the cells are hexagonal, so they kind of fit together. The brown throughout is capped worker brood, and bees, like any insect, have different stages in their life cycle. They're an egg. The queen lays the egg, and 3 days later the egg will hatch, and that will be a larva, and that larva looks like a grub. It's just a little white maggot, and as that grows and reaches a certain point, it will pupate, and it will get the coating over the cell that is a mixture of propolis and wax. And that's what allows the pupa to further develop, and as it reaches a certain stage, it will then chew its way out of the capping and emerge as a young adult bee. This bee, if you look, has hair between its eyes. It has a whole lot of hair around its thorax. That's a very young bee. That bee probably emerged from its cell day before yesterday. As they get older, they still have hair around the thorax and a little bit of hair on their eyes, but it's that hair that collects the pollen when they visit different plants, either for the nectar or for the pollen. And as they move from plant to plant, that pollen that's stuck to those hairs gets dislodged and pollinates each flower as they go along. Bees spend roughly, a worker bee will spend a third of her life from the time that the egg is laid till the time she emerges as an adult. And then there will be a period that she will do household chores. She may tend to the queen, she may feed other young worker bees, the larva, she may guard the entrance, but she's a house bee. She doesn't go out flying. And as she ages over, about 3 weeks worth, then she will go out and start foraging either for pollen or water or propolis or nectar. And they pretty much focus on jobs. You don't see one bee that is getting nectar and then gets pollen and then comes back to the hive. They either go to get pollen or they go to get water or whatever. Water helps with the air conditioning in the hive, but they also need water to feed the young bees.
And as we see, you've got the wax, but from the other one that we saw, there was a lot of holes on the outside. Are you just naturally letting that build out, or they? I mean, because you can see how there's.
When I put the wax foundation in here, they have cut away.
Gotcha.
Areas to walk to the other side.
Gotcha. Can they naturally make their own if you didn't have those inside?
Oh yes, they will draw combs on their own. I sent you the picture of the bees that I took out of the wall, and you can see the hanging combs, and that's a really nice example of the wild bee. Whether it's in a tree or a wall, that it's an elliptical shape typically. It's not filling a frame into a rectangle the way they do for us.
Gotcha.
I can listen to my bees talk to me.
Yeah.
If you get them excited, if you do something they don't like, they will tell you. The tone of the buzz that you hear in the box will change.
Gotcha.
Also, as you work bees, if you've been in the hive too long, if it's too breezy, if it's too chilly, they will start coming out and letting you know. The typical first indication is that they will fly into your veil and bump you.
Gotcha.
We call it head bumping, and it's an indication that maybe you need to be working your way out of that hive.
Okay.
And of course, if we're at the bottom box in the last frame, that's a lot of working your way back out.
Yeah.
So you can listen to your bees will talk to you. This is a good example of wax foundation, and as they draw the comb, you can see it's not the whole surface that they draw.
Yep.
They draw an area and expand it, and typically they will be filling these cells as they draw them out.
Gotcha.
If we wait 2 weeks from now, when the tulip poplar comes into bloom, and that is our big crop in this area for honey, they can draw a box like that top box over there, the green one. They can draw the comb, fill it with honey, dry it, and cap it in a week. Typically, when the queen lays her eggs, she'll start pretty much in one place, and she works circles coming out to lay the eggs, which means that this area is an older group of larva or pupa than out here. And typically they will have a band of honey and sometimes pollen surrounding the area of the brood so that they can go to the side, bring in pollen, bring in honey, mix it together with the excretions from their glands in the head, and feed it to the baby bees.
Gotcha. And is she doing, if she's having to come in and get all these cells, so she's doing the entire box, every one of these, or is it as many as she can?
She will do as many as she can. She can lay as many as 2,000 eggs a day.
Wow.
And get this right for you to see down into the hive or into the cell. But if the light is just right, you can see the little white eggs just above my finger in this area. And as the larva hatches out and grows, the larvae are a little white glistening spot at the bottom in their bed of royal jelly. And as they get older, they're bigger and bigger, and as you see up here, they circle around and almost fill that cell. And then they will, as they get a little bit larger, they will stand up, and that's when they get capped. This hive, we've pretty much gone through. We can go into the bottom box if you want. The only pollen that I have seen in this box to date, right now, is there is one of these frames, and I thought I just had it, had 2 cells of pollen. And that tells me that they are feeding the pollen to the young bees as quick as they're bringing it in. And so my bet is that if we open up the lower box, I would be able to show you a frame with the pollen.
Okay.
And pollen comes in a variety of colors, and you can tell what came in by the color of the pollen.
Gotcha.
And you can see the different cells that have pollen in them, and that there's a variety of colors. I've seen pollen range from almost pure white to almost black. There's red pollens, there's various white pollens, or excuse me, various yellow pollens, and pollen being an essential part of raising the young bees, there is typically a frame of pollen that is right next to the frames that they have the young bees in.
Now, let's just say if there is a hive, if you see a bunch of bees on a post or somewhere around your house, what should you do when you see those bees?
Honeybees are individual creatures, but all together they comprise what we call a superorganism. And the hive is the entity. The queen lays eggs to make new worker bees for that hive, pretty much like your skin produces new cells to keep your skin young looking and intact and doing the job of defending you against disease, giving you the muscular ability to move around. All of these cells form your body. And if we look at the individual bees in comparison, they are the cells of a superorganism. The superorganism reproduces by creating new queens, and all of the bees in a colony that can fly will fly away with the queen and try to establish a new colony, and they will leave the original colony with a succession of queens to take over the original queen's place, and food, and still some young brood. But that once the swarm occurs, there won't be any eggs laid in the colony for probably 3 weeks or a month, while that new queen gets mature enough to go out and mate and come back in and start laying eggs again. And so as beekeepers, we're trying to prevent the swarm, but traditionally that's what we've been taught as beekeepers, is to prevent the swarm. Cut out the queen cells. Don't crowd them, make sure that there's always an excess of space. But what I'm finding and what I try to practice is that when a colony reaches the stage that it feels it is able to reproduce, you're not going to stop it. And so what I try to do, again, in managing my colonies, I try to stay tuned enough to each hive that I know when they're getting ready to start forming queen cells, and I will take those queen cells, either I will gently cut the comb around the queen cell and lift her out and embed that cell into a frame with other bees, and I'll create a small colony of its own, and I will add more space, or if they have created a lot of queen cells, I will divide that colony up. So again, it's all about managing our colonies, and we understand a fair amount about it, but I can't tell the bees, hey, wait, don't swarm. I can't cage the bees like I can a cow or a chicken to control what it does. If I cage these, they're going to die. They have to go out and forage for whatever they need and bring it back in for the benefit of the colony. Does that cover?
Yeah, so if they would leave their colony, as you said, and they come to my front yard, I should call a beekeeper, not to try to go move them. I should call somebody that knows how to.
That's a good idea. I will point out that bees will sting in defense. If I come in here and I'm boisterous, I'm noisy, I make a lot of disturbance, and I squash a lot of bees as I work the bees, they're going to start stinging me and everybody around. But if you're gentle with your girls, they'll be gentle with you. They have something to defend. They have a home, they have brood, they have food, and so they would be very defensive here. If I walk across the grass out here, the bees that are foraging flowers are not going to bother me unless I step on them. Which, if I'm barefoot, like I used to do as a kid, you'll know when you step on a bee. She'll sting you. A swarm has nothing to defend. So typically there's thousands and thousands of bees. It's like a cloud of bees moving through the area. And if you don't bother them, they won't bother you. They have nothing to defend, and they won't sting you if you leave them alone. A beekeeper can come and put them into a box, leave the box there until dark. They'll all be in the box. You close the box up, come back the next morning, and you move the box of bees wherever you want it. When honey's capped, it's capped over with wax, pretty much the way the brood is, except that the wax cappings for honey is very, very pale. It's almost white. And so when you look, you say, that's honey, that's not brood, that's honey. And you will pull those frames out, you cut the caps off. I use a hot knife. You can use scratchers, you can use cold knives, but you cut the wax or you perforate the wax. You then set them into an extractor, which is a centrifuge, that as you spin those frames, there are different configurations. Some of them you spin the frames sideways, and some you spin them with the frame lined up with the center of the extractor, and it slings the honey out against the wall, and it drains down into a collection point that you then have honey. Usually that is screened to take out the wax and whatever debris might come with it. And so when I sell honey, it's not really filtered. The mesh that I use is a fairly small mesh, but all I'm trying to filter out is the debris in it. If you trap a bee in the extractor, you're going to get parts of bees coming out. And I do have customers that have said, do you have any with wings and legs? Because then I know it's local honey.
For the kids that don't know, a centrifuge, think about it like a roller coaster. Whenever you're going through a loop-de-loop, what it does is if you're going through that loop-de-loop, it's pushing you into your seat. And that's kind of what it does. It increases the amount of gravitational force on you, and are on these themselves, and as it's spinning, what it's doing is it's leaving the those wax, I guess the honeycombs themselves intact, but it's slinging out a lot of that liquid that's inside, or the honey itself. And as it's doing it, it's going to be able to collect down and on out, so that he can use this again and still use the you know, the shapes that he's got for those different frames. So and that's
yes,
all he does.
I would be able to reuse the frames.
Yeah.
That is the idea. And to make it a little bit easier, when bees draw the comb, each of these cells is drawn slightly at an upward angle. I think it's about 12 degrees off of horizontal, which means that if I put the frame into an extractor with the center of the extractor here and it gets spun like this, then the wax will flow up the cell and out against the wall of the extractor.
Gotcha. How much honey could you know, so these are your 2 large boxes. How much could come out of that itself?
Well, again, these are brood boxes, and so the amount of honey that is ever going to be in here is going to be limited because that's where the young bees are. So when we start extracting honey, we're taking it from the boxes above this, and a box this size full of honey is going to be about 100 pounds. Wow. A box the size of the pink one over there, where it's yellow, pink, and green, that pink one is probably going to be 65 pounds. We're getting less and less honey. Now, that's partly because there's less and less for the bees to bring in. Particularly with the amount of yards that we have, not the natural areas that we used to have, or the fields of grass and flowers that we used to have. People's yards now are pretty much a sterile environment. There's not a lot of food there. The weeds that we get, like these flowers that are blooming here, are all very productive for both pollen and honey. The cultivars, the flowers that we have developed as ornamentals, don't produce a lot of either. Wild roses that you see at the side of the road, and they're maybe the size of a quarter, the flower's the size of a quarter, and it's a pink or a white flower, they produce a lot of honey. They produce a lot of pollen. If you go look at the tea roses in somebody's yard, bees don't even look at them. Bees don't see red. Bees see up into the ultraviolet, but they don't see red. So anything from the red levels up is what they see. And red flowers don't show up. Now flowers, interestingly, have ultraviolet patterns that we don't see. We don't perceive that, but they have patterns that point to where the nectar or the pollen is. And the bee flying past can look and say, oh, there's my landing map. It says here. And they will fly to that plant. And once that plant has been pollinated, a lot of that ultraviolet disappears. There's no longer a landing pattern because it's not needed.
So from the research I found, it says that 1 in 3 bites of food that you eat every day depends on pollinators. So with what Ralph showed us today, you can see that pollination is very important for our food. Ralph, we appreciate you taking time to instruct us how to be prepared around the bees and how important the bees are for pollination.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank you. So Ralph Harlan and the Lincoln County Soil and Water, if you have any questions, we'll have some data provided at the end. It'll have some worksheets and some information about pollination, the importance of honeybees. We hope you enjoyed our presentation and behind the scenes for honey and honeybees.